Welcome to another one of the National Railroad Hall of Fame oral histories. It's Friday, November the 5th, 2020, and we're at the home of Darius and Stephanie Gaskins in Ipswich, Massachusetts, for what we expect will be a lively interview with Darius. He's had a fascinating career in a Forrest Gump sort of path from West Point to time with Chuck Yeager, to leading the industry through deregulation as ICC chairman, and then putting theory into practice, leading BN from a stodgy old railroad to industry leader in innovation. I had the distinct pleasure of working in his organization after having been with a series of bankrupt railroads in the Northeast, and the energy and creativeness and the ability to take risk was distinctive. So thanks for your time and having us in, and let's start at the beginning. You were born in 1939. Would you just take us through a little bit of the childhood experience in Virginia?
Well, I was actually born in the district and lived in an apartment with my parents, and my mother was anxious about raising children in the District of Columbia, and so she insisted we move to Great Falls. And my parents, when I was 2, we moved out to Great Falls, which was an interesting time. It was 1941, about the time Pearl Harbor came, and all these things were going on. And Washington was on a wartime footing. We had blackouts, we had gasoline rationing, we had all those things, and those were my formative years. I grew up in World War II. And then my mother, I went to grade school in Vienna, Virginia, and then went to a different one. But my mother got impatient with the school system in Fairfax County, which is kind of ironic because Fairfax County now has probably the best school system in the whole country. But at that time, it was largely dairy farms, and she didn't think it was quite up to snuff, so she sent my older sister to a fancy school, and she sent me to Sidwell Friends, which was a school in D.C., which was a shock, going from a country boy with no concerns of the world to go to Washington, D.C. with all the children and daughters and sons of rich and famous people, politicians, etc. But it was a good experience, and it was a good school. And then it's a Quaker school, and obviously I got the full dose of Quaker meetings and the way they think about things. And so my next stop was West Point, which was quite a little different animal.
So how did you, A, decide on West Point, and B, get the appointment?
There's a story. I always, because I lived sort of inside the Beltway or close to the Beltway, I thought Washington was the center of all things. And the military seemed to me to have the right attributes. They were trying to defend the country and make us safe from the communist menace and all those things. And I saw successful military figures there, and I thought, gee, I think I'd like to do that. So that was my notion. It created a little conflict in my school because Sidwell Friends, first, they're pacifists, and secondly, I was a very good student. And they thought it was terrible that a good student would go to West Point, maybe a mediocre one, but not a good one. So I got a lot of blowback from my teachers. And to get the appointment was relatively straightforward. My mother was by this time, was fairly prominent in the Republican Party in Northern Virginia, and she went to our local congressman and said, can you get my son an appointment? He says, we'll have to take the test, but yeah, I think we could probably work that out. I took the test and I got an appointment. So that's how it happened.
And how was your West Point experience?
Interesting. It was quite different than the Quaker high school. But I didn't find it very difficult because I had the ability to stay out of trouble. I mean, at West Point, if you get exposed as a troublemaker or somebody that can be picked on, they'll pick on you. So that didn't happen to me. I just sort of slid through it. And I've enjoyed most of it. I mean, it wasn't great getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning and marching all the time and doing that. But it was all right, and I enjoyed the experience. Made a lot of good friends there.
So when you come out, your commitment to the Army was for 4 years?
At that time, you had to serve 3 years in any branch of the service. But I had a strategic choice to make. I was set up to go in the Army, but at this time, Vietnam was starting to heat up a little bit, and there was garrison duty in Korea, which was not very pleasant, or Germany, which was very pleasant. And then the Air Force, because of Sputnik and everything else, they were trying to gear up to respond to the perceived challenge of the Soviet Union in space. And so they were training a lot of people in aeronautical, astronautical engineering. And they told me, well, if you come with us, with your class standing and so forth, we'll send you to graduate school. You don't have to go to ranger school. You don't have to jump out of airplanes. We'll send you right off to a nice university where there's co-eds. And so I put my hand up. I'll go for that. So they sent me to the University of Michigan for 2 years. And I studied aeronautical engineering and what they call instrumentation engineering. At that time, it now has a different name. But it was all involved in the space program. It was all geared towards the skills you needed to have as an engineer to, put a man in space, get to the moon, whatever your mission was.
So when you come out of there, are you then in the Air Force?
Yeah, I was in the Air Force. I left West Point. I was commissioned in the Air Force as a second lieutenant. Went to graduate school for 2 years, and by that time I was a first lieutenant. And my first assignment was Edwards Air Force Base, which is the basic testing center for the Air Force in California, Mojave Desert. And at Edwards, this is kind of an interesting thing. It wasn't like I figured this all out. Things happened to me, and I reacted to what happened to me. At Edwards, my first assignment was the Dinosaur Project, which was a project that the Air Force had, that they were going to put a vehicle in space, an orbit over the Earth, and then be able to fly it back down and land it at Edwards Air Force Base. And the avowed purpose was to spy on the Russians, basically. Because at this point we had U-2 flying around with Gary Powers had been shot down, and we had the SR-71, which was called the Blackbird, which is a surveillance thing. So surveillance was very important, and that was the mission. But it was going to be tricky because to be able to launch, get into orbit, and then come back down was a technologically different task. And because of budgetary matters, I got there in like June, and I think it was in October. The president at the time, Kennedy, said, we're going to cancel that program. We're not going to do that anymore. So there I am. I'm at Edwards Air Force. My first job, it's gone. So I ended up getting a job at the test pilot school, and I served there for 4 years. And because I had been to graduate school, I owed them some more time. So I was obligated to stay until 1967. And when the time came, the Air Force was not going to be going to the moon. That was been decided. We did have some secret projects involving space flight, but they didn't look real attractive to me. And I said, I made a bad choice. I mean, I think I will go do something else.
So when did you meet Stephanie? And
I met her before when I was in college at a Model UN. She was a political science major at Mount Holyoke, and I would do anything to get away from West Point for the weekend. So I was at this thing arguing. The issue of the day was, should we recognize Red China? That was the issue of the day. And somehow that issue keeps coming back. Different form, questions are there, but it's very serious. We're still grappling with that issue.
And that was in Canada, right?
Yeah, it was in Montreal.
Montreal.
Yeah.
And she just appeared there as a vision.
Yeah, she came with a busload of other student women from Mount Holyoke, and I was there with 3 or 4 cadets, and it was we met.
Okay, but that's a leap from that to now having 5 kids and living in
that's a whole. Well, it took a while to get totally embroiled in this thing. See, I graduated. I wasn't going to get married. Then I was at Ann Arbor, and we had a tragedy in her family. Her mother died suddenly, and Stephanie was at 6 and 7. So we decided to get married at that point, rather than
while you were in Michigan.
Yeah, well, I was in Michigan, so.
So she got to go to Edwards Air Force Base with you?
Oh, yes. We were partners from then on.
And how did she like living in the desert?
She never complained. I don't think she was wild about it, but she found good things to do almost anywhere she went. She loved to hike, and it was good hiking there. A lot of friends. We had made good friends. And she had 2 children by this time. She had a daughter, and then my son was born. And '66, and so we had 2 children at Edwards, and it was a good life. It wasn't bad. I traveled around the world doing things, talking to people about one thing or another, and she got left behind, but that was standard for a military wife.
So she's out in the desert, and you're off doing exotic
Well,
trips.
I was in London, I was in Stockholm, I was in Italy. You know, those some of the tough duty spots. Yeah.
So after the Air Force, you go back to Michigan for your doctorate?
Yeah. Again, a fork in the road. I was not trained for what I wanted to do. Okay, because I remember I grew up in Washington D.C. I always thought the government was important, had an important role, and I realized that the skill set you need to be involved in policy in the government is not aeronautical engineering. That's not right at the tip. It's more important to either understand political science, international affairs, or economics. And I liked economics better than everything else. And I was good at it, though I had very few courses. So I applied to graduate school to get a PhD in economics. And I didn't even want to get a PhD. I just wanted to get a degree in economics so I could go back and work for the government in some policy role. That was my goal.
You hadn't picked out an agency or
No.
anything like that.
I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure what the opportunity would be. But turns out, first, the fancy economics departments in the country didn't let me in. They looked at me. Who are you? What do you think? Coming to Harvard, Yale? You know, what are you crazy? And so that didn't work. And then I had been a good student in Michigan, so I called up an engineering professor of mine and said, "Can you help me out here? I'd like to study economics." And you remember me? He said, "Oh yeah, I remember you, Darius." So he called over to the economics department and said, "You should look at this guy. He's pretty quick." And they took me in. And I had no money. I had a GI Bill, little savings, but I was a good student, and they recognized that, and they started giving me money, fellowships, and stuff like that. So I was basically did quite well financially when I was in graduate school, and it only took me 3 years to get a PhD.
So you're in Michigan with Stephanie and 2 kids,
yes,
and limited income.
Living in a little small house. Yeah, it was not all pleasant.
Right.
But it wasn't bad. We had everybody else was impoverished like we were. The dentists across the way, a good friend of mine. We had a lot of friends. We lived in student housing, basically.
So when you get through, you then go to Berkeley before DC?
Yeah, well, that was a fork in the road. I fully intended to go to Washington. And I now had the pedigree, right? Had a PhD, not just a master's. I had a PhD. But the academics at Michigan said, "No, you can't be going to Washington. We'll introduce you to a few people, but you can't be doing that. We got an opportunity to put you in the big time, son." So they wanted me to interview Berkeley and Princeton and so forth and so on. And those schools offered me a job. At which point I had to decide, do I want to go to Berkeley was a very fancy, and so was Princeton, very fancy economic department. And I thought, well, maybe I'll try this academic thing for a while. I think I can handle it.
What was your PhD thesis on?
It was on it was the theory of pricing for a dominant firm or monopolist. How do you maximize your profits over time when people can enter your industry depending on what prices you charge? So it was just a theoretical thing, but I had the mathematics I'd learned in the Air Force about Pontryagin's maximization principle. I applied that to this problem and got a very interesting answer. And that was my dissertation. Basically.
Good grounding for later at the commission.
Well, it kind of enters in every once in a while. I mean, won't say that any railroad is really a monopoly, but there's always a threat of entry in every market that you have. So the trade-off between making profits in the short run and getting unwanted competition in the long run is always there.
Right.
You have to think about it. But so I went to Berkeley.
How did you pick Berkeley over Princeton?
Probably a mistake. It was slightly better department, had more Nobel laureates, and it was more mathematical. So I felt a little comfortable with it. But Princeton was closer to Washington, and actually, with hindsight, maybe I should have gone to Princeton, not to Berkeley, because I really cared about public policy.
So you're at Berkeley during the time,
1970 to 73 was my first tour there.
right? And Vietnam is going great
Going
guns.
great. Well, I walked on the campus in 1970, and you could smell tear gas in the air because the students had just had a riot and they were attacked by the police with tear gas.
Protest, you mean?
Yeah, it was a protest, yes. And I said, "Ooh, maybe this is not. Maybe I didn't figure this out real well." And it stayed a lively place. Berkeley was very lively in those days, and we enjoyed it. We made a lot of friends there, and we enjoyed the life. But I really wanted to go to Washington, so after 3 years, I asked for a leave of absence, and they gave me a year off and said, "Yeah, you can go to Washington, take a job." At which point, I put my name back in the hopper for some policy-related jobs.
And which hopper would that be?
Well, you have to know somebody. I had my thesis advisor knew people at OMB, and so he was pushing my name for a job at Office of Management and Budget. But I also had a classmate from West Point who was a policy guy who had been at HEW and then had moved with Rogers Morton, the new Secretary of Interior, to Interior. So I put my hand up. I said, "Hey," I said, I'm interested in natural resource policy, and that's kind of like what my strength is. Do you have anything for me? And I went back and they interviewed me, and they said, "Yeah, we can use you." So I went. I got there in like September, I think, of 1973. I think that was right time. And just about then, the war in the Middle East, the Yom Kippur War had occurred, and the price of oil had gone through the roof, and everybody was running around Washington like a chicken with no head, because what are we going to do? We had oil prices going up. We had, because of some policy responses, we had gas lines. We had all kinds of bad things happening because we were highly dependent on oil. So my boss, who was the Assistant Secretary for Policy, said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I think I'll do oil policy." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, you're sitting on the Outer Continental Shelf. Interior controls it. And there's potentially oil and gas there. And we're producing a lot already, but we kind of go real slow with it. Why don't we, in response to this national emergency, why don't we have an accelerated leasing program?" And people said, "Well, that's a good idea." So that I gave speeches and wrote papers, and the next thing I know, I'm in front of Congress, and we're trying to accelerate leasing in the offshore. And it was pretty controversial because people in California didn't want it. They'd already had a spill in Santa Barbara.
I remember that.
People on the East Coast didn't want it then, still don't want it.
Right.
And there was controversy about Alaska because there had been about that time there was a spill. Valdez spilled in the Gulf of Alaska. And so it was a controversial program, but it was good grounding. I got a chance to talk to a lot of people, make arguments, fashion a program that looked like it was arguably in the public interest, and we tried to accelerate to leasing 10 million acres a year, which is a lot of land. And we had some success, but there was a lot of blowback. I mean, we got a lot of opposition. I was in that, I was involved in it, and this was in the Nixon administration. It was one of the few positive things that they were doing on energy. Everything else was negative. They were creating gas lines. They were holding down oil prices. They were doing all these things that were not very good for the country, for the economy anyway. And but this one was potentially a positive because you could get more drilling activity, presumably find more oil and gas. That was the theory. And so I stayed to work another year, and I moved around in Interior. They created different jobs for me, but I was always focusing on mineral policy, particularly the offshore stuff.
And this is during the Nixon years, which obviously unraveled. How was it?
Well, lunch was entertaining. We were Interior building is about 2 blocks from the White House, so we could lunch. We could take our sandwich and go over and sit across from the White House in Lafayette Park and watch the soon-to-be indicted people go in and out. It was fascinating.
Was there an effect on day-to-day workflow because of all the turmoil? No. Didn't impact it.
We just did we were in a favored position because what we were doing was not seen as a threat by either the Congress or by the Nixon administration. The environmentalists felt threatened by us, but not any of the normal interest groups that care about mineral policy. So we were able to press ahead.
So did you then go back to Berkeley?
Yeah, I had told him I'd come back, and so after 2 years, I went back to Berkeley serve for one more year as an assistant professor. And I said, nah, I can't. This is too dull for me.
Theoretical.
Had really had the bug at that point, so I was committed to policy in Washington. And my next job, again, my thesis advisor had been the head of the Bureau of Economics at the Federal Trade Commission, and at this time they had a whole bunch of lawsuits involving people like Kellogg's, cereal maker, oil companies. They were suing everybody over one thing or another. And so I went back there to replace my thesis advisor as the chairman, as the director of the Bureau of Economics at the FTC, which was an interesting job, but it was a difficult time because we had all these cases and they pretty much didn't make any sense. We were doing it in reaction to political pressures, and we didn't always think them through real well. And so we found ourselves with a situation where we had some, what I consider to be unwinnable cases. So one of the things I did in that job was I convened a panel of experts to look at the so-called Exxon case, which is a case against the oil companies. And I said, there's a stable here, and there may be a pony in this stable, but there's a lot of other stuff here. Can you figure out what the theory of this case should be? And if it's not what we're pursuing, we'll shift it over. So they were all well-known people in the energy field, and they met, over a period of time, and they came back and said, well, Darius, if there's a problem, it's nothing to do with this case. You're not going to solve it with this case. It has to do with other government policies. You should drop the case. Which I thought, well, that's a bombshell. I can't wait to tell the commissioners that we should drop this case. Well, it never got that far because my counterpart, who was the head of the lawyers at the FTC, said, not so fast. You people have signed a non-disclosure agreement, and I want every copy of that draft report in my office, and I'm going to put it in the safe. And that was the end of it, as far as he was concerned. And I was stunned because I thought up until then, I was kind of a naive guy, you study something, you look for an answer, you get the answer, you give it to the powers that be. Well, sometimes they don't like that answer, so that one didn't, it didn't go anywhere. But the case didn't go anywhere either. So yeah. No real harm was done, just a lot of wasted lawyer time.
I think that stuff's still in a safe down there.
Well, it eventually got out, and the oil companies knew about it. They knew about it all along. So if they had ever gotten into real trouble in the court, they could pop this. They could get this because lawyers had it. So you're supposed to turn it. You're supposed to turn that over to the other side, right? And some kind of legal procedure, but they didn't.
So you went on to the CAB. Well, how did that transpire?
Well, same deal. I was interested in policy. Oil policy was not going very well. We didn't accelerate leasing very much. We still had price controls on oil and gas, which were hampering a lot of things. And so I was looking for something else to do. And then again, bump in the road, there was an election. And Jimmy Carter was elected president. And of course, he's going to replace all his appointees. And his appointee is the chairman of the FTC. Well, he brought in Mike Perchuk, who was a staffer for the Senate Commerce Committee. And Perchuk had a much different view about economics and about antitrust and about competition policy than I did. And he told me that he really thought I should find something else to do.
Created an opportunity for you.
He created an opportunity. I was a little naive because I said, well, I'm not a political appointment. I just got a Schedule C job here. So, no, I think I'd really feel better with my own band. So I got it. I got the hint. So I then started looking for a job, and I talked to MIT, and they offered me a job. And who else I talked to? I talked to OMB again, and then Fred Kahn, who famous economist who was responsible for deregulating the airlines, called me. He had been appointed to be the head of the CAB, and he was shocked to find out they didn't have a Bureau of Economics. And they were in the business of regulating the economics of the airline industry, and they didn't have any economists. All they had was lawyers. So he said, would you like to come over here and create a Bureau of Economics?
Now, was this the same with Fritz Kahn?
No, Fred Kahn. Kahn. This is Fred Kahn. Alfred Kahn from Cornell.
Got it. Okay.
This is maybe before your time. He was real famous in the 70s, worked for Carter, and was the chairman of the CAB. He had been the head of the PUC in New York State, and had written a book on regulation, economic regulation of utilities primarily.
Okay.
But he was a very articulate guy, and was quite famous at the time on the talk shows in Washington.
So how was the experience at CAB as the new economist?
Terrific.
Yeah.
They didn't, we were trying to figure out what to do. There were all kinds of pressures, and it was good.
So this is prior to deregulation, but not a lot prior to it.
Well, it was deregulation. If you're thinking about regulation of transportation, it was the first step of deregulation of transportation.
And did that happen during your tenure there?
Yes. What we did is we had a series of cases before the commission, before the board, and the most famous one is the Midway case, where there was Midway is a relatively unused airport in Chicago. The board was trying to stimulate use of this facility, and we had an applicant, somebody that promised to come in and provide low-cost fares to a lot of destinations. And the other carriers, incumbent carriers at O'Hare, which is a neighboring airport, said, not so fast, we want that slot, and we are better positioned to handle it. So they all applied for the same authority. And in the past, before this decision, the board had always chosen one and told the others to go pound sand. And so there was a famous meeting with Khan, and we talked about all the options, and I proposed we let them all in. We couldn't be picking winners and losers. We just had to let them all in and see who could handle it. And he was persuaded, and that started the whole avalanche, that and a few other little stories.
So that started it, but then it became institutionalized.
Well, Congress got in the act and they passed a law. So at that point, there was a major fear that because we had done it administratively, that the next administration, if they had a pro-regulation chairman, which
could reverse it.
It could reverse it. So we needed legislation. That was a perception. I don't know if that's right or not, but that was a perception. So they actively, at the same time we were doing these things administratively, they pursued legislation on the Hill, and that was a big time. That drew in Teddy Kennedy, it drew in Stephen Breyer. I mean, there were a bunch of relatively heavy hitters that got involved in this on the side of deregulation, which is fascinating that they picked airline deregulation as the door they wanted to open first, but they did.
And this was bipartisan support for this?
Pretty much. It was just the vested interests were the incumbent, the legacy, so-called legacy carriers who had all the routes. They sort of resisted it at first, and the international carriers resisted it because they wanted to carve this market up, and they had their own international agreements. But what happened was, in the politics of this, very early on, Pan Am, who was one of the biggest of the legacy carriers, looked around and said, this is not working very well for us because we're the biggest. We have all these routes, but we can't get any more. Every time we apply for one, they say, oops, we got to let this other guy in because you had too many. We don't think that's fair. So they decided they were for deregulation. And once they did that, it sort of
opened the floodgates.
Yeah. No, I'm sorry, it wasn't Pan Am. I misspoke. It was United that took that position.
So it's interesting that you're in a Democratic administration, and most people would say, well, they would be more pro-regulation than deregulation. It's interesting that the germination of deregulation and then went to trucking and railroading stemmed from Carter.
Yeah, it all happened on Carter's watch. Well, that's an interesting question. Why then, and why weren't the Republicans on board? Why then was because you'd had a bunch of academic research that had been done that's argued that some of these industries just shouldn't be regulated, particularly airlines and trucking. There were strong arguments that it didn't make any sense to regulate them. They do just fine as competitive industries. And there was some evidence, actual evidence. There was, in the state of California and Texas, you had some intrastate airlines that were not regulated, and they did very well. And people like PSA and Southwest Airlines, they really like to fly on them. So there was evidence that deregulation really helps in some situations. So there was a stimulation from the academic side, and then you had people like Fred Kahn who were just trying to make sense of this regulatory thing, and it didn't make any sense to him. And so it sort of proceeded. And once that caught on, and the low fares the signal feature of deregulation of airlines in the early years was fares were brought down very rapidly because there were people like Freddie Laker that wanted to come in and dump capacity into these markets and take people to where they wanted to go. What a novel idea.
Right.
So he disrupted the industry. And then it caught on, and then people started looking around, wait a minute, what about trucking? I mean, maybe we should take care of that. And that one, same thing. There was academic research that said it was probably a good idea. And the political opposition was much greater with a case of trucking because you had the Teamsters who had organized all the big LTL carriers, and you had the American Trucking Association, which was a very effective political organization. And so there was big political opposition, but Carter appointed me to the commission that made me chairman. He nominated two other commissioners who were like-minded, and we deregulated trucking.
So it's interesting because the Teamsters had a vested interest in
the system as it was.
In the system as it was, and the big carriers did. And you didn't really have, what you have today with the truckload, proliferation.
They couldn't operate. They couldn't get a license to operate.
Right.
It was very limited entry. And one of the early things that happened was that my predecessor, Dan O'Neill, decided that we really ought to free up entry because we were having a problem with rising gas prices. We needed to have a more rational freight system. So we shouldn't have these empty trucks running past each other. So let's open this up and create some procedure, master certificate, he called it, to let people get routing authority so they could, operate more efficiently. And we were well on the way to that, and the Teamsters got really upset with that, and they nudged Congress to tell us to stop. And we wrote back politely, yeah, we'll stop, but we will only stop until next June because, we have to get on with this. The nation needs a more efficient transportation system. So you give us some direction, and we'll follow your direction. But if you don't give us any direction, we're going to go right down this road we're going. And that changed the dynamic of the legislation because the Teamsters could not delay anymore. Because see, if they did delay, we would go ahead. So they have to get a piece of legislation. Then they lost control of the process, and we got pretty complete deregulation of the trucking industry.
Now, you made a sort of a diversionary trek over to the Department of Energy between CAB and ICC,
Yeah.
right? And what prompted that?
Energy prices. See, we had that was the biggest mess of all. I mean, airlines it was nice to deregulate them. It's nice that airfares came down, but it wasn't crippling the whole economy. What was crippling the economy is we had price controls on oil. And we had this silly game where, you had to wait in line to get gasoline, and small refiners were lining up for their special allotment. It was ugly, ugly, ugly. And everybody in the government that was an economist said, this is not very good. We could do better than this. But it was pretty hard to deregulate oil prices because we were fighting inflation at that point. And you were afraid that if you deregulated, the oil prices would run up. And the oil companies make a lot of money. You can't have them making money. That's evil. So there was a lot of opposition to deregulation, but we solved the problem. We argued that prices won't go up so much. And by the way, we'll put a tax on these guys. We'll put a profits tax on the oil companies. So if they make a lot of money, we'll get a lot back for the federal treasury. We ended up getting like zip back because they didn't go up. They came down after deregulation, which is another whole story. But that was a tough political fight. But we had the analytics. We had all kinds of modeling activity in the Energy Department, and we created the scenarios of what would happen, and we persuaded the White House that they could bite the bullet on this particular subject. And the sweetener was the windfall profits tax because they knew that they could use that again to say we're not giving this away to the oil companies.
So James Schlesinger is the boss
Yeah.
at DOE. Is he the same one that then took on the CIA job? Or is that a different?
Yes, he had been, yeah, same guy, but he had been in the CIA before, I believe. I get confused when
which
when he
way
had
it
that
went.
job, yeah.
So deregulation, when you got to the commission, well, I guess I'm interested in learning how you got to the ICC from DOE. Did somebody come knock on the door and say, hey, come on over here?
There was a woman lawyer who was very important in the Carter administration. Her name is Mary Schuman, and she's married to David Boies, the antitrust lawyer. Just that's an aside. She was very able, and she had her heart really into this deregulation thing, and they knew they wanted deregulated trucking, but they weren't sure they could get it done. So she came to me and asked me if I would take the job, and I said, sure. Like it's a job of a lifetime. Why wouldn't you take that job? So I took it.
So I was at the Boston and Maine at the time, and we were one of the few Class 1 railroads that was supportive of deregulation because we're in bankruptcy and we saw that as a path out.
Well, a lot of railroads thought it was a path out. In fact, let me just introduce.
Sure.
I've been talking about airlines and trucking and energy. Those were all cases where we anticipated competition would drive down prices. In the case of railroads, we didn't think that was the case. We thought railroads have had their rates suppressed for years because of the regulation of the ICC, and they regularly turned down general rate increases. And most of us were convinced that if you ever got the government out of this to let up a little bit, rail rates were going to go up. And that was a desired thing because the railroads were virtually bankrupt. You'd had the Penn Central bankruptcy in 1970, which is the biggest financial bankruptcy we had had in this country's history. And after that, we had all these other railroads that were falling apart, the Rock Island, the Milwaukee Road. I mean, we had bankrupt railroads all over the place. So the motivation for railroad deregulation was, we got to save this industry. So we got to take some of the restrictions off. We got to give them the ability to raise prices. We got to give them the ability to exit markets where they can't make any money. And that was the general thesis of the Staggers Act. And it was pretty much agreement among the railroads and the regulators and the White House on that subject. There was some disagreement. Some railroads wanted to keep rate bureaus because they didn't see how you could possibly make rates unless you got guys in Chicago with green eye shades that know more about rates than anybody else. That if you don't have those people, you couldn't make rates. Well, you could actually make rates. You can do it. And the industry learned how to do it. But there wasn't major opposition to the Staggers Act. It wasn't a hard-fought thing. Okay. Whereas the other ones I've talked about, there was substantial opposition.
Well, I recall time at the B&M where in intermodal we looked at it as a real opportunity, but it seemed very simple, right? We were regulated. Now we had no shackles on, and we could go out and do whatever we wanted. But in reading the article that you wrote about the thought process behind the economics of deregulation, it's a lot more complicated.
Well, it is because no economist can make an argument that railroad industry is perfectly competitive. Because the definition of perfect competition is there's lots of people that'll do it. They all can enter a market at no cost.
Like trucking.
Yeah, like trucking. That's very competitive. Not the railroads. I mean, these railroads were built over 100 years, and if you didn't have a rail track somewhere, you're going to play hell building it. There's only a couple exceptions to that. BN itself built into the Powder River Basin to get access to the low sulfur coal. That was the only new entry in the whole business. Now there's minor entries where because of the ports and containers coming on the West Coast, we put infrastructure in, but people didn't lay down main track. They weren't in the business of putting new track down in the 70s.
Right.
They were trying to withdraw.
And so there was always a very cumbersome process. I worked on my days with Norfolk and Western in operations planning. One of the things we did was the economic impact of the abandonment cases that we had to file in front of the commission. And it was extremely complex, seemed to go on forever, and a lot of it got turned down. So how did that changed radically? In
the Staggers Act. That was one of the major drivers. The president of Yale, a guy named, at the time, Rick Levin, had written a very good article about the problems of the railroad industry. And he highlighted the fact that one of their biggest problems was they couldn't get rid of excess capacity. They couldn't abandon lines that they couldn't make any money on. And it was this very process you talked about. The commission would typically turn them down when you tried to. There'd be community opposition beating on the commissioner's door, and they'd give in. They say, "Oh, wait, we'll keep you. You can have your rail service." Didn't cost them anything.
Right.
It just was killing the railroads. So one of the major themes of the Staggers Act was we're going to free up this abandonment process. Would it be so easy? Because we thought that in the railroad industry, now I'm putting on a different hat. By the time I got ready to apply the Staggers Act, I was working for BN. We tried to abandon a bunch of rail lines. And we caught holy hell for it. Not from the Staggers Act, not even from the Congress, but from the local communities, because they didn't want to give up rail service. And we said, wait, we're not going to be able to get through this. We can't have the whole world mad at us. So we got to come up with a better deal, and we did. But
Short lines.
Short lines, yeah. We decided it sort of the story that really puts a highlight on this is we had abandoned a lot of lines in North Dakota. If you look at North Dakota, there's like spaghetti. It's all the rail lines reaching out to all the grain elevators, and we got to rationalize this. We got to abandon some of these lines. And so we were willy-nilly abandoning lines, and the commission was saying, "Fine, abandon them." And then we ran into Senator Mark Andrews, who said, "Not so fast. He says, I don't want you to abandon any more than 350 miles of North Dakota Railroad. And the way I'm going to stop you from doing that, no matter what the Staggers Act says, I'm going to pass an appropriations rider that says the ICC cannot spend a dime on any case involving abandonment of more than 350 miles in North Dakota." Now, that particular amendment probably was unconstitutional. I don't know, but who's going to fight about it? We said, okay, we'll go to Plan B, because we're not going to fight this guy over this. So we didn't abandon any more lines. We just created short lines and sold them to local entrepreneurs. The process was facilitated because under the Staggers Act, as it was interpreted by the commission, a purchaser of a rail line did not have to take the labor contract from the guy that sold it to him. So you could take a line that had to be served with 5-man crews, sell it to the local druggist. He could operate with 2 people, non-union employees, and he could actually make money, whereas you as a Class 1 railroad couldn't because of your labor contract. And that was the driver of at least Burlington Northern short line sales. We did a lot of them, and most of them survive to this day. Most of them make money. Most of them have increased traffic over where they were when we sold them. Not a lot, but some. And we didn't have to abandon them. And we didn't have the communities mad at us.
I think, when I look at my time at Penn Central, limited, but the company had 100,000 employees, I think, at merger day. And when Conrail was finally filleted and sold to NS and CSX, it was down to 23,000 or something like that.
I don't know the exact number, but if you look at the Class 1s, I mean, they cut their employment in half. But that was largely crew consist. You got most of it that way. Under the labor contracts that existed up until Staggers, you had to have 4 or 5 people on a train, right, and had to have a caboose, and had to have all these things. And that was part of the labor agreement. And so you have to renegotiate your labor agreements, fight your way through it, but eventually the railroads got down to a crew consist of 2 people consistently. They're relatively highly paid, but it's a big difference paying 2 people to run a train than paying 5.
5 or 6, yeah, some places.
I think the statistic, when I joined the BN, we had an average of 5.2 people on the trains, because some places we had to have 6 because of a local codicil or something in the labor agreement. And they now operate at two people. And there's been serious consideration given by the railroads of going to 1 person, but I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. There's thought about autonomous railroading where you could operate with nobody. I just think, it's a little bit beyond the political realm. I just don't think it'll happen.
Yeah, and I want to get to that sort of toward the end where we talk about the future, because I think there are obviously some pressures being brought by autonomous vehicles on the highway that are going to impact rail competition.
Definitely.
So back to the halcyon days of the 70s, Reagan gets elected. Here you have a conservative Republican and free market economist who comes in and says,
not so fast.
Oh, not so fast.
The actual story is that the ICC is way down on your list of important positions in most government. It's sought after because you got a nice office and you have a dutiful staff and stuff like that, but it's not a big deal. New coming in administration don't come and say, I've got to pick the right ICC.
And no media spotlight on you.
No. So it's normally not a spotlight, but we had created such a firestorm with motor carrier deregulation that some supporters had gotten to President Reagan and said, you've got to appoint somebody that will really be good on this issue. and they appointed a guy from Nevada, labor lawyer from Nevada, who Reese Taylor, and he was determined to slow this thing down, get a little rationality in this rush to deregulation. Well, he wasn't able to stop it. It was skating, but we'd already opened the gates for free entry.
It goes back to the counterintuitiveness: is the Democrats pushing deregulation and the Republicans slowing it down.
I think that's all. It all has to do with political pressure.
Sure.
I mean, good free market Republicans have donors and important interests in their communities that have interests that are perhaps not the public interest. So you get that all the time. I don't think the Republicans are any worse than the Democrats in that regard, but it is ironic that the people that opposed deregulation of surface transportation were Republicans.
Yeah. Before we dive back into content, I just wanted to point out that we're in a very nice room with a portrait of Stephanie's grandmother. Painted by her grandfather in 1899, I believe.
Yeah, you read it on the...
And it's a remarkable piece, and nice that we can sit in front of it. Before we move on to the railroading transformation from regulator to participant and performer under deregulation, one of the questions I had was, bipartisanship played a major role in getting deregulation through, and I'm just wondering, do you think in the current environment would something like that even be possible?
Well, it would be possible if you had a common view of what the problem was. But the issue I see right now is that the two major parties, they don't see the world through the same colored glasses. So it's hard to see them deciding that this is a problem and this is the solution. If you can get to that point, you can work together. It's not impossible.
Yeah.
And there's credit for it, but it's just difficult right now because they have really diametrically opposing views about what the issue is and what one should do about it.
So deregulation, particularly I think in railroading, created some challenges for transition from a industry that was regulated in everybody's lifetime, right? To now, what do we do with this that we have it? And managing that transition is something I'd like to talk about, particularly as you went from being the ICC commissioner to moving into marketing at Burlington Northern. I guess before we do that, perhaps we could just go back to that transition. How did you get from the ICC to the railroad, and Dick Bressler, I think, who was chairman of BN Industries.
That's an interesting story.
Yeah, and we want to get to that.
Yeah.
So
I first met Dick Bressler when I was the chairman of the commission in 1980, late 80. I believe it was after the passage of the Staggers Act. And he was a pretty conscientious CEO because he realized that a lot of the issues the railroad had to do with the regulator. So he decided it made sense as the new CEO to come see the regulator. So he came to my office, and not too many CEOs came to my office. I mean, it wasn't a common thing in those days anyway. And we had a nice chat, and I asked him a series of, I guess, provocative questions. I said, you have a wonderful property there. I mean, you've got railroads that run all over the country, and you've got this emerging coal franchise. How come you don't make any money? And he humped and humped. But he was well aware of the substandard economic performance. And but we talked about, big, just political issues in general and the railroad business in general. And then he left. Well, the election comes along. Reagan's elected. He informs me that I'm not going to be the chairman. He's going to appoint Reese Taylor as chairman. I still had a spot on the commission, but I didn't want to sit there in a chair and have somebody else run the place. So I said I'll resign. So I then here it is January. I got to decide what I'm going to do, and Bressler had invited me to a policy conference of the railroad. And I went out and met all the railroad executives. And
this is after you've resigned?
Yeah, I'd resigned. And it was in February. And they said, would you be interested in joining us? We probably can find room for you in this organization. I said, well, I don't think that would be smart for either one of us because I just finished approving your merger. And you don't need to have a lot of questions about that process, and I don't want to have my integrity impugned by what appears to be a little short-term gain based on that. So let's just say we had a nice conversation. That's the end of it. And I had a friend, same friend that got me the job at Interior, who was working for an Atomis oil and gas company in Houston. He was the president of it in Houston, Texas. And he offered me a job. He said, "Why don't you come down here? We got this company. We're kind of small, but we're aggressive and got a lot of money from our Indonesian franchise. We're going to make this thing go." I said, "Okay, I don't know much about oil and gas, but it's all right. I'll do it." So I went down there, and I was in charge of marketing and finance primarily for the subsidiary. I didn't go to capital markets and raise money. I just was worried about how we bid on leases, how much we paid for things, and how we marketed our gas. We were primarily a gas producer. And it was an interesting job. I learned a lot. But after about a year and a half, the chairman of the holding company, which was in San Francisco, Dorman Commons, comes to me and says, "Darius, I'd like you to take a serious look at running our coal company, which is located in Louisville, Kentucky." So, due diligence, I said, "Fine, I'll take a look at it." So I travel to Louisville, Kentucky. I go down in this coal mine, which is a mile under the earth, on my back, running around, and they're blowing off explosives down there, and I got a little bit of claustrophobia. So I get in here, and I come back out of the mine, and I go back to Houston, and I say, "Well, the guy wants me to look at it. I think he's expecting an answer. I better find something else to do, because I don't want to turn him down and stay here, because that will probably not do me a lot of good in the future. And I really don't like the coal business, particularly that mine."
Right.
So I got on the phone. I called the only people I could think to call, because I didn't want to be an academic at this point. The only people I thought to call were two railroads that had talked to me about potentially joining. One was the Santa Fe, and one was the Burlington Northern. And I called the Santa Fe, and I think I got Larry Sina. I think that's who I talked to. He says, "Well, I'll ask around, Darius. I mean, we'll see what we do." He didn't get back to me. But about 2 months later, he said, I ran into him somewhere, and he said, "I asked around. We didn't have any real spot for you, so we didn't want to pursue it." But I called Bressler, and a week later, I get this call from Dick Grayson, who was the chairman of the railroad for him, to meet him in Fort Worth, and Walter Drexel, the current president of the railroad. And I met there, and they offered me a job as the head of marketing. And it was kind of a new position. They had marketing people, but they didn't have a overall head of marketing. And they didn't give me everything. They didn't give me the coal department, but they gave me all the other marketing department: intermodal, grain, chemicals, so forth and so on. And that's how I got the job.